see the world through other people's eyes. Now, empathy is a quality of character that can change the world.
Good morning. Welcome to Artefact Live. My name is Scott MacArthur. This is a show where we look at the art and science of storytelling. And this week we're going to be looking at storytelling at work. Now, this is one of my absolute favourite topics, and I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to do this in 3 parts over the next 10 weeks or so. So there's probably going to be, well, next week I'm going to do a particular show about film. I think the following week I may have one about magic, and then I'll come back to work because there's so much to talk about in this space. But I'm quite excited about this one, so I hope you find it useful. And the reason I'm excited is that this is probably the subject that is least considered in the leadership world, that I believe can give you a real edge. And it's something that we can all do. A lot of us think we can't, but we can actually all do it. But I'm going to gently take you into how I got interested in this. I'm going to tell you a story, of course, about how I get into it, and then via a few artifacts and a couple of stories, including whiskey. I'm gonna try and get you thinking about how you might be able to use story at work. But a few points of administration before we get going. If you're watching from the Empathy Engine Facebook group, thanks very much for tuning in. If you want your name to appear in the chat, if you've got any comments, in the Empathy Engine Facebook group, you'll see there's a little link there. It's on the screen just now. You need to click that, and 3 clicks later, it doesn't ask for any particular information. Just click, 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 and your name will appear in the chat if you ask any questions. So thanks for that if you can do that. Anyone else, if you're tuning in via Facebook, it should happen okay automatically, so you don't need to do this. And certainly from LinkedIn, YouTube, Twitch, and Twitter, it should work reasonably easy. It's a bit of a footer that you've got to do that from a Facebook group, but hey ho, I'm sure there's a reason for it. I haven't got a clue what it is, but I'm sure there's a reason for it. So that's really all the particular admin I have to do. Last week was terrific. I really appreciated the feedback from my session with Peter Edge. I thought Peter was fantastic, and he brought a particular combination of another subject, lost knowledge, we talked about last week. Hence, I think I've still got my fedora sitting here. We talked about lost knowledge, and he brought a sort of humbleness and a comedy to the program that I really appreciated. And again, a bit like storytelling, lost knowledge is one of these things that people just so rarely talk about, and yet it can really help an organisation. So if you haven't seen show 28, please go back and have a look on Facebook. It's up there. It's well worth watching. It was a terrific show. So this week, well, where do we start? Storytelling at work. I've said it before, and I'm going to say it again. Storytelling is the leadership competence that has the potential to do have the most impact, but receives the least amount of attention. If you go and look at an MBA program, very rarely does it talk about storytelling. If you go and look at online courses about leadership, very rarely do they talk about storytelling. Now, there has been, during lockdown, a little bit of a growth in the whole idea of storytelling, which I'm so happy about, but I still think it receives far too little attention. It's something that I think, I've said it again, I'll say it again, can give you an edge at work, in your personal life, anywhere, if you're able to tell stories. So where to start? Well, I thought I'd start with one of my own stories, really, and it's a short one, but it explains how I get into storytelling. Let me just double check that there's no questions. No questions yet, that's fine. Hello, thanks for joining. I can see you popping in. Do you know, I love this time on a Tuesday morning. My telephone goes, all these things appear on my various social platforms, so it's really great. So thanks for joining me, folks. And how did this start? Well, I had, as those of you who have tuned in before know, I started my career off as in research, in arthritis research, playing about with microscopes. And then I moved in by luck and happenstance into HR. Now, some people might not think that was lucky, but it was. And I actually joined a company which I will always be grateful for their training, for their support, and for the friendships I've developed over the last 30 years with these people, and that was British Gas. Now, I joined them at an interesting time. It was just when Thatcher had basically gone through a process of privatising all the key services in the United Kingdom. I won't say much more on that. You can probably tell from my voice that I was not impressed. Anyway, but because of that, there was a whole load of things happening in the gas industry across Europe, and I was lucky enough to be part of that. And one thing that we got, and it's something that British Gas did really, really well. Now, I remember my HR director, and for the life of me, I can't remember her name, which is really embarrassing. I've even asked my colleagues from back then, and we can't remember her name, which is really odd because she was fantastic. And I was working in a town just south of Manchester at the time called Altrincham, and that's in Cheshire. So it's where all the sort of the footballers live and all that sort of thing. It's not that fancy, but it's a nice part of the country. Anyway, we had a absolute commitment to learning, and the reason for that was, and I got that from the HR director, because I said to her, we were setting targets, and I was personnel officer, welfare and recruitment. There's an odd combination, but that's what it was, welfare and recruitment, with a lot of staff, with 30,000 staff, a lot of recruitment I was responsible for, and a massive commitment to welfare, which is all coming back, which is interesting. Anyway, and one of the things that they used to do back then was they would set targets for us. Now, in vogue at the time were competency interviews, competency models, where you had to, when you were going through an interview process, you had to ask the delegates specific questions, and they had to give specific examples of where they had done the things they'd said on their CV or in their application. Now, it's gone out of fashion a little bit, but there was a part of it was interesting because as part of the training to do this, we had our own college at the time. It was called Mere College, which was down a bit deeper into Cheshire. It was very beautiful, it's now a hotel, a beautiful Cheshire hotel. That'll give you an idea of the quality of the building. It was all higgledy-piggledy. It was 200 or 300 years old. Squeaky floorboards. I can even remember the smell now. But that was our own little private college dedicated to our learning and development. And if any of my gas colleagues are watching, you'll remember it, because it was an amazing place. Anyway, I was doing what was it called? The Certificate in Management Studies. And it was horrific because it was one of these portfolio-based certificates, but we all had to do it. And I didn't like it because it was all about, gathering evidence, and it got a bit tedious, to be honest. But anyway, we were doing it, and the training that was supporting it, though, was very, very good. And there's one fella who, complete legend in British Gas Northwest, his name was David Kelsall. David, unfortunately, has passed, but he was a very funny, quite gruff golf fanatic who liked a dram. And but it was a very good trainer, and a very how to describe him. Maybe if someone's in from the gas can help me here. But he was a very honest chap who said what he thought to everybody. Some people find him quite rude, but I thought he was a friendly grump, if you like. But anyway, he ran a lot of the training for us, and I was a middle level personal officer. That's equivalent to the HR business partner that you get today. And we were doing a course on, I think it was on relationship management, and we were looking at gathering data and evidence from our careers. And that was okay, but the bit that really caught me, and I'll never forget it, was right at the end of one of these. I think it was a 5-day event in this amazing college. And David would start to ask questions around the room. And I remember asking these questions about, okay, tell me what your experience is. Now, he wouldn't take any BS. He would, if you started to talk about, well, I was working on the sustainability of the value of the whatever, the sort of Simon Sinek bollocks, he wouldn't accept it. He would say, no, I need a story. I need you to tell me what you actually did. Now, what he was doing was he was looking at the competency model and saying, right, I've got to get these kids, because he was a good 15, 20 years older than us. I've got to get these kids thinking about their stories at work. So he was thinking about a progression, to be honest. So that was the sort of model they had at British Gas at the time. It was quite progressive in itself. But I remember sat there in Mere College, him asking me questions about how I knew or how I could demonstrate that I was statistically competent. And I think it was at that point that David got me thinking about my previous career, because I was only young. I was only young daft laddie, and I hadn't really thought about my scientific career that much. And that might surprise you, because nearly every week I talk about when I was in the laboratories, but I didn't then. I hadn't analysed it. And remember last week and previous weeks as well, I've talked about how you need to be an archaeologist of your own life. Well, I think that was the moment that I started to think about the value in my own story in my career. So that has developed over the years, and thank you, David. He was such an interesting chap, but I think that was the genesis of it. But now, 30 years later, is it 30 years? Yeah, it's roughly 26 years later or something. I'm sat here and I'm broadcasting about storytelling, and it's such an exciting time in the world of work to be interested and aware of the power of storytelling. Now, you'll know that I talk about, and I'll do it at the end of this show, at the end of every show I say, remember to share your own stories, because those stories can change the world. And it's true. And I'm going to give you homework this week. For the first time, I'm going to give you a film to watch. There's a reason for that, but because I think that we need to really explore that a little bit further. But let me tell you why I think this is exciting. I think the digital world has democratized our ability to broadcast our stories, to distribute our stories. It used to be that the power for distributing stories out with an organisation was really difficult, because maybe there was newspapers and magazines and maybe television and radio, but that was it. And if you're running a small business, or you're running your own, you're creating your own personal brand. Now, brand's something I'm going to talk about a fair bit today. You didn't really have ability to share that brand out. So your brand was, if it was a small brand, it was pretty much guaranteed to stay a small brand, apart from word of mouth in your area, which could grow and it could become big. But now the opportunities are much bigger than they ever were. Now that, I think, is really interesting. And let me give you an example of that, because I think this is an area that a lot of us forget. And I include myself in this sometimes. I mean, I'm better at it than I used to be. But if you see yourself as a brand, there's a lot you can do using stories to get people engaged in that brand. Because I believe stories, I've never really used this metaphor before, but stories are like a magnet. They can magnetize the environment. They can bring people towards you very strongly. Of course, they can repel them as well, like a magnet. If you turn it the other way around, it repels people. But let me give you a little example. A few years ago, I've got a book here I want to show you. If you've ever heard of, there's a Scottish writer who is pretty famous out with Scotland. He's written some brilliant books like The Wasp Factory, and books like The Crow Road and Espadare Street, which is my particular favourite. His name is Ian Banks. And he also wrote some amazing sci-fi. And I mean, we've had a show about sci-fi, and we talked about how sci-fi is basically the story of change. But this particular book is different to all the other books that he wrote. And within this, he actually hooked me into something that, it's become part of my life. He tells a story in here. I mean, it's about whiskey. And I mean, those of you who know me, I like my whiskey. And I'll put this, I won't put it on the screen yet, actually, I won't. I'll just tell you the story. Basically in here, he talks about examples of extreme whiskies. Now, I like my whiskey strong. I like the strongest of them all. It's one called Lafroig. I think it's a glorious whiskey, but a lot of people really find it difficult to drink. But that's not the point of the story. The point of the story is he then says, I also like wine, and I think there's a wine that is comparable to Lafroig. And this wine, I've got a little picture here. This wine is called Chateau Moussard. And what he says about that is, the comparison, I think, is most apt in the wider field of drink, is probably Chateau Moussard. This is one of my favourite red wines in the world, and it is profoundly different and it's well worth sitting within the canon of excellent wines. He goes on to say a lot about the flavour, and I'm not going to bore you with the detail. He does say it's spicy, but it's so different that it almost gets its own category of wines. Now, the Chateau Massard wine, if you've never heard of it, it blows your socks off. I mean, it's a very strong and spicy wine. But Ian goes on in that brilliant book. If you're interested in Scotland or you're interested in whiskey, I don't think there's any better book, Raw Spirit in Search of the Perfect Dram, than this book by Ian Banks. It's absolutely glorious. But he goes on to describe not only the flavour of the wine, but he also goes on to describe how it's made. And I think more importantly than that, sorry, I've got something in my eye, how it's made and by whom. It's by the Hocher family, and it's actually a Lebanese wine. Now, that's not a famous part of the world for wine. But the other thing that's even more amazing than that this wine really had its genesis during the Civil War in the Lebanon. And he paints a picture of these vineyards, not big, they're not huge because it's a special wine. It's quite a rare one, not so much now, but it was back in the 80s, quite a rare wine. And he paints a picture of this winemaker, Sergio, making the wine amidst these bombs falling out the sky. Literally, I mean, it was literally in the middle of the Civil War that they started to make this wine. That was it. Hooked. I was completely hooked. I thought, yeah, I've got to try this. So I went out. It was 18 quid a bottle. Now, for someone who was an aficionado of Aldi's own white wine and Aldi's own red wine, spending 18 quid on a bottle of red wine was quite an investment for me. I now buy it in crates because I love the stuff. It is absolutely brilliant. But I think he got me with the story. And it's a very small. It's not so small now. It's still a small. It's not a hugely well-known wine, but nevertheless, it's growing. But it's still a small business that, through the power of the democratization of social media that I talked about before, to distribute stories, has become a world-class brand. Now, that was only the introduction for me. I mean, these are the sort of things that they're everywhere now, and I'm sure you've got your own examples of that now. If you've never tried Chateau Massard wine, I dare you to go out and try it. And I've got a few comments here. I'd just like to say hello to people. Good day, sir, from Twitch. Hello, I think that's Andy. Yes, it is. Thanks very much for joining us. That's lovely. Hello, Doug. How are you doing? And Doug says, if you remember, I used to use stories to sell £100 shots, yes, of cognac at the hotel. It's insane what a story will make people do. Absolutely brilliant example. You know what, Doug? I'd forgotten about that. I think I might need to have that story in my little book, because what Doug did was exactly that. He would say, look, this came from a particular place in a particular barrel, and it's so old. I think it was 200 odd years old, Doug, if I remember right. And it puts another point across that's really interesting. I've actually, purely by coincidence, I've got this as a caption if I can find it. Where is it? Yeah, here we go. Doug, look at that. Without any prompting, people tend not to recall the data, but they tend to remember the stories. And I hadn't thought of that story for 20 years, but it still embeds in your brain and it comes out at the appropriate time. So I think it's a great example, that, Doug, thank you for sharing it, of how important it is to start to become an archaeologist of your own stories. So where do we take that next? Well, there's so many ways I can go here, but I think I'll stick to I'm just going to tell lots of stories today because there's so many of them in the workplace that I think they're just telling them will help you. I'll give you another one. I was working for one of the big IT companies, a company called Atos, which used to be KPMG Consulting, Siemens Consulting, and then it ended up being called Atos, and I was working there about 10 years ago, I left now. But we had a particular deal, or a potential deal, with the Royal Mail. And I was responsible for a team called the Impact Team at the time. And our job was basically to use storytelling and different techniques to win his work. Now, it turned into quite a successful endeavour, and I'm very proud of those days. And the team that I had are still a world-class team. I mean, they've all left now, but they're all in great jobs. They're doing really, really well, and I'm so proud to work with these guys. But let me tell you this story. The bid that we were looking at was a big one. It was £200 odd million. It was one of these big IT platforms. I think it was SAP, but it might have been Oracle that we were trying to put into the Royal Mail. And one of the jobs I had was the bid teams. So these are the guys that would do pitching. They would go in and they would pitch to the customer, usually near the end of the process, to see who could win the deal. The team came in, and I'd been helping them a little bit, and they did a pitch, and they did okay actually. It was all right. But I was sitting there thinking, how is this different from everything else that these people are going to see? And the answer to that was it wasn't. It was a fairly what they call a vanilla pitch. It was a vanilla product. It was a sort of thing we knew would work. They knew would work. And when you get vanilla, it tends to come down to cost. Now we knew that we had a competitive deal. We could give them a competitive deal because we were a massive company, and we knew we were competitive. But we also knew that people like Capgemini, Fujitsu were also competitive, and so we had to think, how can we help them remember us after the event? Now remember what I said about people might not remember your data, but they tend to remember your story. So what we did was we had a brainstorming session. We had this glass sort of cube that we used to work in. Everybody could watch what we're doing, and we used to write on the wall, on the windows, and we used to stick things in the windows. It was quite radical at the time. It's a long time ago now, 10 years ago, but more than that, 12 years ago. But we used to do this, and we were thinking about, what did Royal Mail do? And I asked the team, what did the Royal Mail do? They're all like, well, that's an obvious question. I said, oh, come on, what did they do? And it was like, well, deliver letters, deliver parcels. And back then, there were many more letters going out than there were. Like the email hadn't taken off the way it has come and gone since. But so I thought, okay, letters. What does that mean? And they all looked at me and they went, "What do you mean? What does that mean?" I said, "Well, what's the product? Letters." I said, "Right. And what about letters? What do you think about letters? What makes a good letter?" And we had a little discussion about it. And then somebody said, I can't remember. I think it was a guy called Greg. Actually, hi Greg, if you're watching. He said, yeah, the lovely handwritten letters are beautiful, aren't they? I remember getting them from my grandmother or something. He said, I can't remember. I'm making it up. Greg, forgive me, I'm making it up. But it was something like that. And I said, okay, why don't we handwrite the deal, the proposal? Now, this was a document this size. And I said, why don't we handwrite it? Because we need to make sure that they remember our story against all the other competition. This is a money deal. This is a deal on price, not on product. How do we help them remember? So what we did, I kid you not, we went out and we found a calligraphy company, a company that writes letters for a living. And we commissioned them to write our proposal in ink, actually more than that, with beautiful handwriting, with the fountain pen writing. And we sent it as part of our proposal. More than that, when we did our pitch, we did the whole pitch with slides using the same font. Now, there's clever ways you can do it. You can actually do it with your own writing now. You can actually make your own writing into your own font. But in those days, we just got the standard font and we used that, but in calligraphy like writing. And I remember the feed. We won the deal. And I remember when we got to know the client, and we'd go out and have a drink with them and we'd chat to them about things. And I asked them, I remember asking the procurement director at the time, I remember saying to her, I said, look, why did you select us? She said, well, absolutely honest, Scott, because of the way you presented the proposal, because all the prices were basically the same. We remembered your proposal. We loved the effort that went into it. That's why you got it. Right. So again, linking it back to the story about, because of digital freedom and digital democratization of distribution of stories, you've also got to think about how do I differentiate myself in the market from other people if I'm in a competitive environment, or from other organizations if you're in a sales environment. So once again, storytelling came to the fore, and also how you deliver that story came to the fore. So I hope they found that. That's a true story, and I was delighted with that. That technique became part of the way we actually did all our bids. We would sit down and we'd say, right, okay, who's this company? What do they do? How do we then deliver the proposal or the pitch or both in a way that matches their environment? And that became a very, very strong differentiator for our organization. And I do remember, I have to say, a lot of other consultancies starting to copy that. But that started that day in that glass bubble where we were talking about the Royal Mail and how we could differentiate ourselves. But I think the one I wasn't directly involved in it. I was sort of had set the hair running, but there was a bid we did for a Formula One team. It was for it was at Wilson. Yeah. Is that the right name? Can't remember. Anyway, I think it was them. And what we did was we got these handheld. It was back in the day when the IT wasn't quite as complex as it is now. Hold on, let's take this caption off the screen. And we basically these handheld like Formula One steering wheels, and in the middle there was like a little screen, I guess a forefather of the iPhone, and on that we actually got our whole proposal animated, and it was on there so that when they could do that, give it to their kids, but also they could remember the unique way that we delivered that pitch, and we won that work as well. So it is definitely a way. So the story is important, and the way you deliver the story are important, and in the corporate world it is critical that you start to think about that. So why stories? Well, I've never really spoken about this, and I'm not going to dwell on it this week. I think it's going to be one I'm going to come back to in a lot more depth. But about 10 years ago, I came across some quite interesting research into what happens in the mind. And previous guests, Linda Shaw and Ashok, have spoken about the impact of stories on the brain. And if you haven't seen those episodes, I'd urge you to go back and have a look. But there's one particular hormone that's released called oxytocin, and it's kind of called the love hormone. And there's all sorts of nonsense around it, how, if you take oxytocin, it can make you more trustworthy. All that stuff is in progress. There's no definitive outcomes from the research at the moment. Well, not that I'm aware of, but nevertheless, there's something about how a good story releases that magnetic hormone. It draws people towards you. And that's where I want to take my next story. But before I do that, I'm just going to check to see if there's anything in the chat that I should be sharing with everybody. There's nothing really there. No, I'll leave those. Okay, so the next one I want to tell you about, and I think Andy's in, so this is interesting. Andy's part of this. I'm very keen on culture and very proud of being a Scot. And I'm always looking for ways of, thinking about Scotland, whether it's poetry, literature, art, whatever. And the reason for that is I don't think there's enough of Scottish proper culture out there. There's a lot of sort of hedrum, hodrum, red hair and tartan, shortbread nonsense out there. I know that because I used to work in a kilt maker that sold nothing but shortbread, tartan and nonsense usually to gullible Americans, but and Japanese people. But I'm always looking for ways of finding culture and sharing that. And you've been victim to some of my poetry and to people like Hugh McDermott and Nan Shepherd that you probably have never heard of. But these are the sorts of people I'm always looking to promote on my vlog and in my writing. And one day, I'm bringing 3 or 4 stories together to make an answer. It didn't happen quite as perfectly as this, but Andy and I, who's on, we do a live show on a Friday night about a music venue called the Glasgow Apollo, and that doesn't matter if you were never there or you don't like music. It doesn't matter. But it's been astonishing because we are now getting on average 100 new members to our Facebook group every week, and it's got like 9,100 members at the moment. So Andy and I are kept pretty busy by it, but it's an amazing thing. And then I think about 6 months ago, I don't know if you remember, Andy, if you're there, but I think it was about 6 months ago. I can't remember who. One of us had the idea that maybe we should start to capture some of the stories from these people on video. And that came to me really from another book. And this book, this is an amazing book. If you've never seen it before, it's become quite a phenomenon. Humans of New York Stories by Brandon Stanton. And this is a gorgeous book. And it's basically, as it says, it's basically lots of pictures of people in New York. And underneath it, there's a very brief story. And there's a number of these really resonated with me. There's one in particular, I put this down, it's a big heavy book. One of them in particular, and it's just one picture with one line, right? A picture and a line. Here's my favourite one. I love this. Look at this. Now, I like my skulls, my memento mori. Remember what it, remember to make the best out of your life because it's short. This is a guy who had on his arm a tattoo, and the tattoo's there because these are the coordinates of a cabin in Arizona where this fella almost died of carbon monoxide poisoning. Just a reminder. I was like, whoa, look at that, and I thought, I love that. And I thought, I wonder if we could do something like that with the Apollo. So Andy and I started to ask people to contribute. And I have to say, it's been tough. They're all probably over 45. A lot of them are over 60. And so a lot of them aren't particularly used to using technology, but nevertheless, they've started to come in, the stories. Now, this is really important because it again acts as a magnet. And I think this is why the Facebook group has been so successful. There's a lesson there for anyone running a business or running a Facebook group. I'm going to show you a very short clip of one. Now, this is ridiculous. This guy is a professional filmmaker. He works on one of the big American TV shows that you definitely know. He's at that level. But this is a guy called Doug who very kindly sent us this, and I'll keep talking while he's. Here's Doug.
Gig here at the Glasgow Apollo was
always brilliant. Had used these professional skills. Now, remember, this venue closed in 1985. And what he's done is he's created this background, he's created this image, and he tells his story about how he's a big Stranglers fan. Now, the resonance with that is fantastic. The oxytocin is flying with all the other people in the group. And you know what? We're both extremely proud of that because what we've done is we've created this community around story. I don't know if you're there, Andy, if you want to say anything about it. If you do, come on, mate, and say it. But it is extraordinary. And here's someone saying, who's this Facebook user? I was at the Apollo. I remember harvesting the mushrooms off the flock wallpaper. Ugh! That's true. The Apollo did smell a bit. But the point of that is that the stories is what I'm terrified of losing. We produced a book a few years ago, and it's full of people's memories. But now I'm, along with Andy, very keen to grab the actual moments to get people to talk about them. And there's a huge lesson here for corporates, an absolutely massive lesson here for corporates, because, how serious are you about things like alumni? Well, I know. We spoke about it last week with Peter Edge. Companies don't take it seriously. They just move on. They just move on. And they forget that corporate intelligence that's in the organisation. Now, we're only doing it in a fun way for a music thing, but that actually is a very powerful technique. Capture the stories because they can save you time and money when the new people take over from the people from the past. So just think about it. But I think the main thing is the Humans of New York, the Glasgow Apollo stuff has all gone really well. And I think it's because of storytelling. Absolutely because of storytelling. So what are companies doing in this space? Well, I was fortunate enough to speak for Microsoft about 2 months ago. And because of that, I got a bit under the skin. And I'd worked there before, but it was about a long time ago. But I got under the skin a little bit and asked a lot of questions. And, this sort of curiosity. Story, you could argue that stories are curiosity manifest. But anyway, I was asking stories. I don't know if you're there, Stacey, but hi, Stacey, if you're there. And she told me lots of things about what Microsoft are doing in this space. Now, Microsoft are by no way perfect, and I don't really particularly believe in benchmarking, but I like what they're doing in that space. They've got things called Storytelling Sundays, where the Microsoft teams get together online and they just tell each other stories. It's absolutely brilliant. Because from that, they then create a better understanding of each other. They create empathy between each other. But then they have stories that they can use when they're out there talking to customers. So how do I do this? Right, this is something that I had some help from an artist friend of mine. There's a word that you don't need to know what it means really. I'll tell you, but it's not important. In the scientific literature, I think I've even got the book here. I have, yeah. Hold on. One of my my books are falling down. One of my heroes in biology is an ant biologist called E.O. Wilson. Now he went in and out of fashion over the last 30 or 40 years. He's in his 90s now, but he's still hale and hearty and writing. But one of the ideas he had was about how knowledge isn't as defined within channels as some people think. And he wrote a book back in the 90s, called Conciliance. Now, this is a word. It's not his word, but he's very much associated with it. And I don't recommend the book, unless you're really into studying science and art and how they mix. It's not a book. I love it, but it's not a book that I'd particularly recommend. It's quite heavy going. But in that, he says, if you look at something that is probably real, so an effect, whether it's and I'm stretching the metaphor a bit, stretching the story, but whether it's customer service, whether it's a general service or it's technology or it's a physical, product, the more people from different he calls them magisteria, but more people from different areas that say, yeah, this works, tends to make it likely that it does work. And therefore it's something that you should buy. Something is conciliant. It's got multiple routes into it that suggest that it actually works. So I thought about that. And I thought, right, how can I use that? So I've got this friend of mine, David, who's been on the show, a terrific artist, and I got him to draw the word. But what I got him to do is to draw the word, but through what I call my story world. And this is a way I think people could use story or start to develop their archaeological skills in gathering their own stories at work or out of work to use in their personal or work lives. Now, in this picture here, you can see some of them are obvious. You'll get the microscope. The O is tartan quite deliberately. The N is my writing tools. The S is my consulting and network, as is the I. That's the specific consulting one. The saxophone is there to represent the Apollo and the music stuff. The microphone, the I, is my speaking. The E is my commitment to personal fitness. The N is a rugby player, not only for my love of rugby, because I'm also involved in the rugby world. The open mouth is about communication and sharing stories. And the elephant is one of my absolute favourite stories about cognitive diversity. So you can see that my story world, this is where when I'm preparing a speech, or like the other day I was writing, I was just sat down and I thought, what am I going to write about today? I use this as this story world to create my specific storylines. So from each one of those parts, I'll pick out, I can say, okay, let me think about music today. And the minute you say something, at least certainly with me, the minute I say, right, I'm going to think about my music memories or about my music passions or my beliefs or whatever it is, favourite music, where I saw it, how I saw it, who I was with, I then start to pull out stories from it. And guys, it really works. So that for me is one of the ways that I would suggest you start to create your own stories. But let me take it a step further. And to the good old BBC again. I know they get a lot of flack these days, but I think a lot of that's fair. But anyway, that's another subject. But there's a BBC World Service show, and it's actually, I think it's stopped now. Don't hold me to it. But what they did was they were talking about storytelling, and it was what was it, Catherine Gore, I think her name was. I can't remember if that's the right name. Gore, something like that. Anyway, she would go out in the streets and she would just say to people, "Where are you going?" That was it. And it was unbelievable how rich and how deep the responses were. When people found out it was a radio show, they would start to talk about what they were actually doing. I'm going to visit my sick relative, or I'm going shopping and I'm going to get this, and I'm going to do that. I'm going to the library because I'm interested, and it would start to generate, I call them generative experiences. So it's a generative experience that starts to push out your stories. And just this week, Andy, who is here, I sent it to him. I was sitting thinking about education, and I thought, well, I need to go right back to the beginning. How did I get to where I am today? And started to think about when I went to college. And I sat down and I hadn't thought about it for 30, maybe more than that, years. And stuff just started to come out. So if you are looking, and a few people have asked me, how do you get your stories? Where do they come from? Well, I think it's quite important to just look at your own stories, go back and think about your own stories, your own experiences, and try to pull them out of yourself. When you get stuck, though, you can use some techniques. Now, one of the ones that, again, I used a lot, and I used this with a very large company sales team. They were struggling a bit with the corporate stories, and I thought, well, I've got to get them out of the environment. I've got to shake them up a bit, sugar them up a bit, as they say in Scotland. So I come up with this idea of taking them for a walk and a talk. But walk was spelled W-O-K. It was actually to a restaurant where they had one of those teriyaki tables, the round tables where they cook the food in front of you. So I went and I took them there. But more than that, we'd hired a very well-known chef in that domain. And he was telling the story of how the food became what it is. And of course, they got curious. And then they started to ask questions, and then we just left them. And I was there, there's a guy called Ian, who was the boss guy at the time. And we were just sitting there listening to the guys talk. And actually, it was amazing because in the office, they were all fairly corporate. That's why I've got that picture of the guys with the eye there with the shirt and tie. They were all a bit stiff of a lip. But we got them talking, and it really, really worked. And it started unleash, if you like, and that's a very wanky word, but get them to really think about their own particular story. There are ways you can do it. I mean, another example, let me just check thanks for the feedback, Doc Genius. I love it. Yeah, that's good. I can't ask for better feedback than that. Maybe get you to come on and tell some of your stories sometime about alcohol. Why that word for your art story? Which word? Conciliance. Just remind me there, Joe. I'm doing this live, so I quite often forget stuff when I'm talking live. So if you could just remind me, that would be great. It's one of the perils of talking live on a broadcast. Sometimes forget what you even say. But another one, and this was a way of trying to sort of break people's perception. I did a keynote for all the suppliers. Let me just take that off. Sorry, Joe. Let me know what you're talking about there, and I'm sure I can answer it. I was doing a keynote in a fish factory, believe it or not, for the London Olympic Games. Now, it was quite peculiar. There's a story behind that as well, and I will write this out one day. But what happened was the guy who runs the fish factory, his fish factory had been demolished, and he was given money to rebuild his fish factory somewhere else because the land his original factory was on was being used for the Olympic Games. But he was a canny so-and-so. And what he did was he got the money, and then he built his fish factory, but above it he built a conference suite with a massive window. I mean, massive window. I've got pictures. I must look them out. A massive window looking onto the Olympic Stadium. And I'm in this room with 400 suppliers, right? Nearly all technology suppliers. All of them basically in competition with each other. It was a bit tricky. But what I did was I called my talk the other AI, right? Didn't tell them what it was, right? And AI, artificial intelligence. That's what they thought. But they walked in and I said, there's another type of AI and it's called appreciative inquiry. Now, don't worry if you've never heard of it, doesn't matter. But basically, it's a technique that you can use. The idea is you use it to find good stuff in an organization. Once you find that, you spread it throughout the organization. So I thought, right, what I'll do is I'll use this AI technique. And you may have heard me talk about this before when I used it when I was working in the sales environment, but I did it, and this was in the tech environment. So I got them in the room, 400 companies, and there must have been 800 guys in the room, people in the room, sorry. And I just said to them, like, on this wall facing the Olympics, I want you to tell me the good stuff that's happening because of the Olympics. And on that wall facing the other part of the fish factory, a bit smelly, I want you to tell me the things that are holding you back. Boom, off they went, right? I don't know, 4 hours later, it's a bit more complex than that, but basically 4 hours later, they came back and there was all these key themes. They'd all started chatting to each other. That was what I was actually doing. It's typical psychological based experiment where it's not the experiment, it's actually what happens when you're doing the experiment that matters. And we got out of them some of the key themes, the key concerns, the problems that they had with perhaps other suppliers, etc., etc. We got it out of them. And it really helped the Olympic Games become extremely successful. So that's another way I used it when I was working in the big bad world of business. So just before I check the chat again, just a reminder, this is Artefact Live. My name is Scott MacArthur. And what we do in this show is we look at the art and science of storytelling. So let me just check and see if there's any more questions, see if Joe's managed to remind me what why the word in your art story. Right, you need to tell me what the word was. Is this Conciliance you're talking about? Yes. Well, Conciliance, I use that because I think it's a great way of. That's why I use poetry as well, Joe. Because I can talk. The poem I frequently talk about. Start close in with the step you don't want to take, not the first, not the second, not the third, but the first, by a poet called David White. I can use that in the performance management domain. I can use it in the technology domain. I can absolutely use it in the program management, project management domain, because it just transfers. It's conciliant. It hints at a truth. So without me having to do this sort of, what's the date? In fact, last night I was talking to Samantha, my other half, about a project she's working on. It's quite complex, and I won't talk about the specifics, but I said to her, look, what's the basics? What's the first step that you want them to take? And she went, oh, right. And off she went, and she was thinking about that. Even in the project management, she's an expert, but even in that area, sometimes the obvious thing is right in front of your face, and you need to look for ways of talking about it that aren't actually direct. They don't need to be in your face. They can be indirect. And that's why I use that for one of my art stories, Joe. I don't know if that's the question you're asking, but hopefully it was. So, what I'd like to end with, I can't believe I've been whittering on for 45 minutes. That's amazing. Let me just double check something first. Yeah, we're okay. I'm really pleased this technology's worked this week, because the other thing that I was doing, I had my fingers crossed behind my back, because this is the upgraded version of Restream that's now apparently compatible with video, and it has been. Andy, you'll be pleased to hear that from the Apollo show point of view, because it's been a right fiddle the last few weeks trying to go backwards in time. It was 86 Chrome was the only one that would let you play video without it stalling all over the place. So pretty annoying. But what's Andy saying here? Not sure it's for the general public. Don't understand. It must be for something else, Andy. Sorry if I'm misunderstanding you. Anyway, so I want to end with something, and it's homework. Now, I'd really like you to do this because I think it's something that is extremely powerful. Now, you know that I've always said facts tell, but stories sell. And this is a film. I've got a picture of it. It's here. Now, for those of you who are not into musicals, you'll be glad to hear it's not the play Les Miserables. It's a film. And now I'm not sure how to pronounce his name. Ladji-Lie, I think. Ladji-Lie. It's a film, and it's on Netflix. I checked this morning, and this film is amazing. Now, it is in French, and Ladji has a long story behind it, but basically what happened was he grew up in what is effectively the council estates we have in the UK, or the projects that they have in America. And when he was young, he was given a cine camera, and he used to just film things that were going on around him. And some of these things were, well, pretty difficult and pretty, tough. And it looked mainly, and this is why I think it's appropriate today to use this as homework, because a lot of it was about the tension between local people and the police. Now that, of course, is all over the media at the moment. And the thing that really drew me, it's a very good film. If you've never, it is definitely a couple of hours well spent. So it's time well spent. Oh, look, I've got my time well spent merch on. Look at that. Look at that. They're flying out. I've sold 2. But this is a story about living and growing up in these council estates and the sort of out the peripheric part of Paris. And it's really quite powerful stuff. So it's a good film anyway. But the kicker is that President Macron saw the film. Now, you know that I like to push stories. Well, he saw this story. He saw Ladji's story on the film. And what he did was he set up a commission to look at inner cities and peripheric council estates in Paris to see how they could improve them. So that story did actually generate a significant change of policy. It changed that world of work within the equivalent of the council that we have in the United Kingdom. So it's a very, very good example of how storytelling. Some of the movie, watch the movie, I don't want to spoil it. It's not all true. There's bits of it are dramatised, etc. But very powerful. And if you would like to see proper story in action and how it then took France to a different place just by watching a film. We're seeing it just now with is it Seaspiracy it's called? I think it's a Seaspiracy about fish. There's a lot of issues with that film, and I might come back to it actually, because scientifically there's huge holes in it. But nevertheless, it's creating a change, a horror almost, in people's perception. Now, the final thing I'll say on this is that I've had the pleasure. Well, is it pleasure? Well, I'm appreciating being involved in the consequences of the Grenfell fire. And if you're overseas, the Grenfell fire was a terrible fire that happened in London a few years ago, where many people died. And the reason for the fire spreading so quickly was basically the cladding in the building. It's horrendous. And I've been working with the different parties involved, so the services like the councils, the private property developers, the police, the fire brigade, the ambulance service. You get the vibe. And I have to be honest, it's been tough. They're very ingrained cultures. Lots of them very good people, but not all the same, and find it very difficult to find common ground. And one of the things I had them thinking about, this was before lockdown, because obviously it's had to be diminished because of lockdown. I was trying to get them to come out with stories a bit like what Ladji did in that film, to share their stories to try and affect change. That's work in progress. It's definitely not finished. But so that's it for this week. I'll just check the chat once more. A couple of bits and pieces. Yes, Conciliance. Yeah, thank you. Okay, Joe. I'm sorry I was being a bit thick there. Yeah, that's why I use it. And I mean, I know you're interested in science, Joe. And Conciliance, I think, honestly, is a word that should be much more common, but people have never heard of it. I think it's a brilliant word. Brilliant. Why different topics come to the same conclusion tends to make the outcome more likely to be true. You'd never say fact if you're a scientist, but nevertheless, it's about things being more likely to be true. So I hope you enjoyed that. The other reason why I've given you that homework, of course, is next week we're looking at film. I've been excited about doing this for ages, and I put in the Empathy Engine Facebook group about 2 months ago, what's your favourite film? And I've had a whole load of these, so I'm going to talk about them. But I think film is really important because it can be about true stories, or it can be about fiction. And during lockdown, we've become obsessed with films, haven't we? We binging on Netflix, binging on Amazon, binging on Sky TV, whatever it is you watch. So there's something in there that I really want to explore further. So thank you very much for tuning in. It's been brilliant. It's been nice being on my own for a change again, because I've largely been having guests, which has been quite cool. Oh, the other thing I forgot to mention, and Andy's there, the other thing that's come out of the storytelling piece about the Glasgow Apollo is there's a radio show coming on shortly. It's called If Walls Could Talk, and I'm delighted to say that one of the things they're featuring are the stories from our Apollo guys. So not just in the group, from out with the group, but I will publicise that across the socials where it's available. So you'll hear my dulcet tones and others talking about that, bringing the stories out and trying to attract people to join our Facebook, etc. But as I've said before, when you go from today, watch out for stories. This week could be the week where you spot a story that could change the world. A bit like the Les Miserables film, it's changed that Parisian world. It really can be powerful. So thank you ever so much for tuning in, and I look forward to seeing you next week. And remember, if you have any questions, just drop me a line, whether it's in the Facebook group or scott@sculptureconsulting.com. That's scott@sculptureconsulting.com. And I'd be delighted to get back to you as soon as I can. So thanks again. See you next week, folks, where we're talking about film.